Good morning. Happy to be here at my 7th, I think, Identiverse. Really honored to be able to talk to this community. I enjoy this community a lot, and I enjoy just, even more so than being able to present to you guys up here. It's the hallway conversations. It's the after 5 conversations that we have that we get into the fun stuff that's really enjoyable. So thrilled to be here one more year. Today I'm going to talk about zero trust for B2C architectures. It's from an architect's point of view. Last year, if you saw my talk last year, it was more of a workforce-focused discussion around zero trust. Today we're going to dive into more of the B2C, kind of the SIAM, is what it's called now, aspects of zero trust. And so let's get into it. My name is Andrew Cameron. I'm a technical fellow in the IT security organization at GM. I specialize in identity and access management. I've been in identity for quite a while. Probably, 2004 means 18 years or so-ish, 19 years. So a long time. I've seen a lot happen. I started off when we were called the directory team. Identity and access management really wasn't a thing back then, but it's been really exciting to see the industry kind of evolve from those days and see how critical it is in the enterprise today. So, as you know, with GM, we are we build cars, right? And everyone knows that. But what's not as well known is that we are transitioning ourselves to be a software and services company, right? And what's really exciting is to see that transition happen into what we're calling a software-defined vehicle. And there's just so much going on that it's whether it's our new Ultify platform and to see the kind of how that's going to revolutionize how services are offered to the customer in the vehicle, whether it's things like even us contributing to open source standards, right? The U protocol is a new protocol that we're contributing to open source to allow a standard method of all of the components in a vehicle to talk to each other. It's kind of really exciting stuff. And of course, we're all still advancing technology, things like our Ultra Cruise technology, which are, lauded across the industry as one of the leading features that we can implement. So it's really an exciting time to be involved at GM because all of these cool features require cool tech behind it, right? So the IT organization is really involved with making these things happen. And the other implication of that is that these things need to be secured. All of these transactions, all of these communications from the customer holding a mobile app on their mobile device to everything that happens in the vehicle when they send a command to their vehicle, all of that needs to be secured. All of that is under attack, as you might guess. And so it's a lot of challenges involved with securing it, but it's exciting. It's exciting work, and it's good to be here and to be involved with it. So let's talk about, I want to lay out kind of a map to how the rest of the talk is going to go. We're going to cover kind of as a highlight the key areas of securing a B2C architecture, then we'll dive into each one of those areas. So let's talk about it. The client, well, first I want to get into actually laying some groundwork in terms of understanding the differences between workforce and customer-focused identity, right? This is a Gartner picture that I like a lot. It covers kind of all of the key areas that span across workforce and customer identity, kind of the workforce focus features on the left and the customer focus on the right, and then you see some overlap. The areas that are of particular importance, all of them are from a security perspective, but on the right, if you see where it talks about high scale and self-service, those are the aspects of B2C focused identity that really make a difference and have implications from a security perspective. So that's kind of some of the things that we'll be talking about and focusing on in today's talk. So let's get into the architecture. So the key components, obviously the client is a key component, and the client, for the most part, is untrusted. It is hostile, right? There are more and more ways that you can understand how to protect the client, but for the most part, you have to assume, especially in a zero trust architecture, you have to assume that in a B2C focused environment that the client is going to be hostile, and you have to have ways to protect it and make sure that only valid traffic gets through. Another key component is going to be kind of what I'm calling the edge protection components, and that's things like web application firewalls and things like content delivery networks will play a role in how we secure the overall architecture. And then the main component here is the IAM platform, and I'll get into why that's important and what are the key components in protecting the IAM platform. And then the main thing about what, all of this is about protecting your back end, right? Protecting what's running in your enterprise resources. And typically, that's going to evolve into an API security discussion. I believe, and most believe, that API security is really that next battleground that really needs our investment and focus. And identity is going to be a key piece in protecting that back end. So let's talk about the client. There are many aspects to what's required to protect the identity. Table stakes these days now are using the open standards and using the identity standards in protecting the client. And that means using OpenID Connect and OAuth. You should be up to date on the latest release of OAuth. There's a 2.1 release of OAuth that has lots of great practices on what should be implemented in terms of protecting your clients and your identities. And so that means, pretty much from a user perspective, that means using the auth code flow with the PKC extension. So that's really important to get that first layer of protection for your users and how they establish their identity. And in addition to that, and I'll get into kind of more about what this really means, but you should be implementing risk-based MFA that is part of your identity platform, but it impacts the client. And so it's really important to be able to get risk signals from your client and be able to have policies that can react against them. Another aspect it's getting, that has some impact in terms of user experience is around identity federation and how much you want to support federating to external identity platforms. The recommendation here, and this may be seen as controversial, but really I see federation as a way to identify the user, but it's not really a way to protect the user. So when you identify the user, you should be implementing your own second factor or multiple factor challenges on your end if you use a Google or a Facebook or even an Apple to identify the user. And so that's just something that you might want to take into account. And I'm going to get into mobile app security. So then now there are tools out there that can allow you to get more trust out of your mobile apps and to have more reliability on the traffic that gets sent from your mobile apps. And so there are mobile app security platforms that can provide some real benefit here as well. And look, we're an identity conference, and I think you can see probably 10 or 15 presentations that are talking about passkeys these days. WebAuthn is the way forward, right? WebAuthn is the standard that's going to allow us to not only get rid of passwords, but it's going to bring a new layer of protection, a new level of protection in securing our customer-facing services. So get familiar with it. There's got some ways to go. There's the user experience guidelines that are being published this week, I heard was just announced. So get into that, understand what passkeys and what WebAuthn standard brings to the table. Okay, so mobile app security. A lot of things that end up happening when you're trying to protect your environment is that you need to understand kind of where that traffic is being initiated from, right? And so you're trying to understand how to block the malicious traffic and then let the good traffic go through. So how do you know how that's happening? And so typically what you're seeing nowadays is that you'll see attackers, they'll work with rooted OSs, they'll work with decompiled versions of your apps where they're extracting keys, and that's why using a token-based architecture is so important, because you don't want to embed keys into your applications to get to do API interactions in your back end. And so what they're doing is they're decompiling your app, they're sending malicious traffic to your back end, and it's causing all types of malicious behavior on your back end. So you want to have something that is able to detect that and filter that traffic. And so now what we're seeing is there are tools that are able to basically have what I call a benevolent man in the middle, where it will filter your traffic from a mobile app. It will attest that the application that's actually communicating to your back end is a valid app. It's actually an app that was downloaded from the App Store. And there's also the ability to provide validation that all of your requests that are going to your back end are coming from those legitimate clients. So that blocks the ability for an attacker to profile your APIs on the back end and then start sending malicious traffic from scripts and from API testing clients, right? And so that's really important to be able to provide that layer of protection from the mobile app. So now you're securing your backend APIs, you're sending validated requests to your backend APIs. And so that's where you get real benefits in protecting your overall architecture. So there's several mobile app security tools that are out there. Firebase App Check is an example of one of them. And these provide some real protection in the environment. Let's talk about the edge. Edge, as identity professionals, you may not be as plugged into these services that are protecting the edge. Obviously, web app firewalls have been around for a while, but they are now getting features that are directly impacting how identity services will interact with them. And so they now are really becoming that first line of protection from the open internet, right? And so you now are able to do rule-based enforcement in your WAF that can be based on things like the OWASP Top 10. And not only can it be on the OWASP Top 10, but it can be on the OWASP API Top 10 as well. I'll get into that a little bit later. But the key things of how it protects it is that now it's using threat intelligence. These services, and I don't do a whole lot of mentioning of AI. I'm sorry, I didn't. That's one buzzword I didn't put in the presentation today. I didn't put AI in. But it does use threat intelligence. It does use machine learning to understand the traffic that's being sent into your back end, and to be able to use your policy engine to be able to block that traffic, right? So that's really important. You really want to make sure that your clients don't have any visibility to your back end, so a web app firewall is kind of the key way to do that. Content delivery networks are now evolving to have features that are security focused, and will either have WAF features built in, or they'll interact and integrate with your WAF components. So those are also key components in the overall architecture. Okay, so the IAM platform is where all of the identity magic happens. And so the key aspect of what you're getting out of, and the recommendation here, the assumption here is that you are implementing cloud-based identity services. If you're really interacting with a customer population of any scale, you really want to trust the scale and the cloud strength that you're getting from the major platforms. And those products will vary. GM is a Azure shop, so we're an Azure B2C shop. And most of the products will implement the key identity flows in 3 or 4 key workflows that we'll call user journeys. And that's sign up, sign in, profile edit, password reset. And the thing about those interactions is that when they are exposed in your applications, they're now attack vectors, right? They're now ways that attackers will leverage getting access into your environment. There's a number of ways, they can throw malicious traffic to your back end. And so these workflows should be abstracted from your applications, and you really want to leverage the identity platforms for this capability in terms of keeping these common identity services consolidated and protected, and let your applications leverage them in a common way. And so that's kind of a nice feature of these platforms. And I don't know if you're familiar with, Microsoft has just announced a new version of their product where they've actually consolidated the Azure AD and the Azure AD B2C products into a single SIAM product. So that's kind of exciting. So this is kind of the B2C identity platform. So now how do we protect it, right? What are the key aspects of protecting the platform? And so there's 3 kind of major components. There's the IDP endpoints. And so when you think about enabling your applications to be able to authenticate to these identity platforms, you're using these common OAuth endpoints that are part of the protocol. And those are exposed publicly, and they need to be protected, right? And so it's critical to be able to have that routed through your WAF, and right, and have those endpoints that can't be abused by attackers. The sign-up flow, sign-in flow are also those workflows, interactions that are exposed in the platform. Your applications will call them. And again, those are critical endpoints that need to be protected. And I've talked about how they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable through things like DOS attacks, bot-based attacks, basically anything that can tax your back-end environment. This is something that you need to be aware of. Sign-up flows are really vulnerable to creation of fraudulent accounts. You can end up with millions of fraudulent accounts that are used to initiate fraudulent transactions on your back end. So the more of the protection that you can put on that front end, the more that you can protect the creation of fraudulent accounts is going to be really critical. And then obviously the sign-up flow, that's the login interaction for your customers. You need to have intelligence there that is, being able to detect brute force logins and all of the various forms of password and account abuse that are in those platforms, right? And so how do you protect it? Again, I talked about the WAF and how, there are out-of-the-box OWASP rule protections that you can use. There's also fraud protection components that can actually be enabled as part of the identity platforms. And they end up allowing you to make an API call to kind of validate whether this particular email address or whether this phone number is valid or has it been maliciously used previously. So that's kind of taking advantage of the threat intelligence that those platforms provide. And again, there's also the risky sign-in protection where it takes the metadata of the sign-in transaction and it allows you to set policy to say, if you're a North American vehicle owner and you're trying to sign in from Uzbekistan, maybe there's something wrong there. Maybe we should block that or force a step up for that login transaction, right? And so those are all features that are typically enabled with the identity platform, but they're really critical in providing that end-to-end protection. So the API security is, again, it's an aspect that, I could have another whole talk about it. It's really a critical aspect. I think it's this next battleground where really needs to be more investment in being able to kind of bridge what the identity protocols are bringing to the table and how they're used to protect the back end. OAuth 2.1 goes a long way to do that, but I think that there's a lot more that we can do in terms of making those standards more usable. It's still very complex to get those APIs protected securely. So there's a lot of typical vulnerable paths to get to and expose and to abuse APIs. I can't tell you how many times we've done security scans of GitHub and where we see API keys stored and open on GitHub. If in your environment, do what you can to block or scan and protect that, because that's really just, obviously it's an open attack vector. Another thing that's part of the recommendation here on moving to token-based architecture is that you really want to stop doing, API keys in order to secure your APIs, because those are, they can be phished, they can be filtered out and used to throw bad traffic against your back end. In our case, we have tens of millions of vehicles that are IoT devices. They need to be secured. They need to have the same level of protection in terms of validating the source of that traffic and being able to make sure that there's not some sort of a fake device that someone has maliciously compromised a vehicle identity in order to get traffic to your back end. And I talked about how the mobile app is so important, right? And so there's a lot of discussion a lot of discussions I've had with our business in terms of how best to secure mobile apps and, getting rid of things like ROPC-based authentication and moving more towards the modern auth in the mobile apps. And there's a lot of discussion that happens with the business because there's a lot of protection of the user experience. And as security professionals and as I use the term security professionals, but identity professionals are security professionals, right? That's one thing I want to make sure that I make clear, and it's important to be able to push those standards into the products that you're supporting and being able to enforce things like, hey, we need to do modern auth protocols, we need to be able to do MFA according to modern auth protocols, and sometimes that will affect and impact how the experience is implemented in an app. So I mentioned the OWASP API security top 10. There's a release candidate for a new version of it out that I encourage everyone to take a look at. A lot of the same vulnerabilities from the 2019 version are still there. Things like broken object level authorization. So that's where an attacker will create a fake account in your environment. They'll profile your API backend, and then they'll swap out any other identity with the token that they use with the fake identity. And because you're not checking the fact that you're only supporting the calls from a particular authenticated user, that there's authorization breakdown there. And so there's a lot of benefit in being able to understand these vulnerabilities and how to protect them and block against them in your application. So I encourage everyone to take a look at that. And so there's some API security recommendations here. There's more than what I could list here, but the things that I thought were really important is, and this seems simple, right, today, is use an API gateway, right? Don't expose APIs to the internet that are not behind the gateway. Just do yourself that favor. Take advantage of the benefits that you get from using an API gateway architecture, throttling, rate limiting, all of the cool things that the API gateway products are doing. Take advantage of that. I've mentioned token-based authentication and authorization. Really important to be able to have a standard way to interact with services on your back end. And when doing that, and then you really enable yourself to take advantage of claims-based authorization. And that really is something that's really important to be able to set policy. And if you're, if you're in a microservices-based architecture on the back end, that still is something that allows you to not only do a coarse-grained level of authorization, but you can also use claims-based authorization to do fine-grained level on the back end. Highly recommended you do that. And again, I can't do it justice, but I wanted to mention them in terms of these token management patterns that have evolved. The Phantom token pattern is about basically leveraging the opaque access token to pass it into your back end, and then do a token exchange of then taking that opaque token and leveraging against your making calls against your back end to send back to the client a more rich and more meaningful token. What that does is that it allows you to sort of isolate key information from the client in scenarios where you might have an exposed client. You're protecting kind of private information from being exposed through a token. The token handler pattern is another evolution of that where, and in the diagram here kind of gets into that, where it allows you to leverage the access token to do introspection and then get more rich information from your back end based on the user that has authenticated, and then you can send back responses that are more aligned with your authorization policies. So I wanted to mention them here as guidance. There's a lot more content obviously out there that gets into the details of them, but I think these are at a high level good recommendations to look into and follow. Okay, what's my, oh, here we go, I was hitting the wrong button, sorry. Okay, so, as an architect, you always got to have a splashy picture that gives you that end-to-end view. And so just bringing everything together, if you take a look, when an auth request comes in, it hits those edge gateway components, it hits your WAF and your content delivery network, and then there's an interaction with your identity platform. And so these are the things that we talked about where those IDP endpoints are plugged into various components in your identity platform that you have authored policy to allow valid traffic to come in. There's identity protection rules that have been enabled in your platform, and there's fraud protection rules that have been enabled in your platform that help protect the overall user experience. And those are implemented in user journeys and workflows. So then from that interaction, the token gets issued, and that is what actually gets sent to your back end, right? And so this is kind of that end-to-end view of how these tools can be implemented to kind of secure your overall B2C architecture. There's a lot, obviously, that goes into, again, API security is a topic that I love and I wish I could have more time to go into, but it's a key aspect of this overall for sure. Okay, so the other aspect, I'm glad I threw this in the slide and I didn't forget it. The other aspect that I want to talk about here is telemetry. And so you probably, as identity professionals, you've heard about ITDR. And so there is a huge amount of benefit in being able to make sure that you understand all of the interactions from each one of these components in your platform. You need to be able to tie these together and to use them to give you some insights into your traffic and behavior from your customer-facing traffic. And so ITDR is really going to be an emerging kind of, I wouldn't say it replaces what you get from a SIEM, but it really gives you that identity-focused view into threats into your platform, right? So if you're seeing spikes in the amount of requests that just come into your login page, you're probably being attacked. If you see spikes in the number of accounts that get created in your environment and you don't have any real business reason why, you're probably being attacked. If you see spikes in the amount of failed login volume, or even more so, spikes in the amount of MFA failures, right? You're probably being attacked. So those are things that ITDR will give you the insight into and to make sure that you are very well plugged into the comprehensive data that's available from these platforms. And there's some work to do to kind of tie it all together and link it all together, but it's really important to get that understood. Okay, so I'm out of time. Let's wrap up. Let's talk about takeaways. So I think, and this is something I wanted to throw in, that there was one of the keynotes there was a CISO-focused discussion in one of the keynote presentations at the conference, and it's really important to understand that And I know a lot of your organization's identity may not be part of the security organization, but in our experience, and this is a recommendation from our experience, that IAM belongs with the CISO office, right? It belongs in the security organization. There's huge benefits to that. I've been around long enough to see it exist in both sides of that fence, and there's a lot of benefit in bringing it and managing it under the security organization. I've talked about how important API security is and how important identity is to API security. Really a primary component of your strong identity strategy. Telemetry, talked about that. It's a must that you have that end-to-end view in your environment and to be able to leverage that to give you insights. And I also talk about, the fact that, identity folks are security folks, right? They represent kind of that first level of security for your applications in your organization. So you have to kind of represent it in that way. You have to be involved as early as possible for these key initiatives to make sure that the proper security perspective is enabled across all of your solutions. So really important there. And I also talked about kind of how consolidating and taking advantage of what those identity platforms provide in terms of consolidating your security journey. It's very important to be able to do that. You don't want to splinter those journeys and have various applications implementing various aspects of the IAM user journeys. Keep them consolidated and manage them as an overall service. That is it. I managed to get in good time as well. Everyone's going to go see Across the Spider-Verse, right? Yeah, yes, you got to go see it. I got to have a Marvel representation in my talk, so thank you.